am on. Okay. Well, how's everybody doing? Good? How's the week been? Yeah, you excited about Resurrection Sunday? You guys going to be hanging out with family and friends and that kind of thing? You got plans? Good. Good. Hey, there we are. We're on. You found me, Tim. Awesome. So, we are in the book of Daniel, you guys, and we're going to be finishing up chapter 1 today. That's my hope and my goal as we sort of walk through this amazing story. We're on the subject of standing strong in a pagan world, and I do want to look at some headlines with you today as we get started. So we'll start with a few headlines, try to get through those quickly, just sort of filter through some of that. And then we'll jump right into the Word of God as we look to see what God did in Daniel's life as he was navigating the challenges of living and standing strong, really, in a pagan world. And so, how many of you guys watch the news? Okay, almost everybody. I tend to try to avoid it because, it's depressing for me. So I don't, I went through a phase during COVID where I was constantly reading the news and looking at stuff, and then I got into this crazy state of anxiety and of depression, and I was like, man, this is horrible, and so I had to stop watching and reading the news every day. So now my routine is about once or twice a week. I'll tap in and see what's going on in the world. And, and it's not, it's hard to avoid things, so sometimes stuff will come across on my phone and I'll see things that are happening. So I guess I'm reading the news most every day, but not intentionally, it just kind of pops up. But, so there's some interesting things happening in our world, and the things are progressing, and I'm reminded of Jesus' words in Matthew 24 when his followers and the disciples asked him, well, Lord, what will be the sign of the end of your coming? And instead of being silent, or instead of being sort of, wishy-washy on his answer, or giving sort of a runaround answer, Jesus just directly answered them very pointedly, and he gave them specific signs of the end. And I don't believe that we're living in the end times. I don't believe we're in the time of the Great Tribulation or of those 7-year period. But I believe we're living in the last days. And, in the last days, as you guys have heard me say this, they began after Jesus rose from the dead and the church was born until now. Okay, and so it's fair to say we're living in the last days, but I think we're living in the latter part of the last days. And there's a lot of evidence for that, like the nation of Israel having come into existence in 1948, 76 years ago. And some of the events that are taking place right now around the nation of Israel are quite interesting. And but our world is spiraling and sort of moving, I guess, if you will, in a specific direction. And you guys have heard me talk about this idea of how Paul describes in Romans chapter 1 that people will begin to worship the creation rather than the Creator, and that would be a sign, if you will, of the last days. And so one of those worshiping of creation is sort of wrapped up into the current global movement of climate change, all right? I was talking to one of our church members earlier this week who's lived longer than me, I'll just put it that way. And she says to me, when I was a kid growing up in school, they used to tell us that the planet was going to freeze, that the next ice age was right around the corner. And then it changed to, no, the planet's going to heat up, and we're going to have this global warming thing where the polar ice caps are going to melt. That was my generation. When I was growing up, particularly in the 90s, it was global warming. You got to put your hairspray away, the ozone layer's wearing down, and the polar ice caps are going to melt, okay? This was the message. And I remember people saying things like 2010, the polar ice caps are going to melt. Or even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think, was quoted as saying 2025, this was several years ago, that New York City will be underwater because the polar ice caps will have melted. And so here we are, less than a year from 2025, and I don't think New York City is in danger of being underwater from melting polar ice caps. Okay, so all that to say, and by the way, they've shifted now from global warming, which was sort of the big deal for a couple of decades, to now climate change. Which seems convenient to me, by the way, because climate change could mean anything. I'm like, well, okay, you've conveniently changed this worship of the creation to something that is so generic that we could label any and every event that happens on earth as part of climate change. It's going to rain on Easter Sunday here in Hemet. Climate change. It's like this is a sign of climate change. And so it is a little bit ridiculous and absurd. But part of this climate change movement has been a sort of a cultural and a social movement to try to convince people that we need to change our lifestyles, specifically in the areas of energy and how energy is used and consumed. And so, the big message and push right now is to get away from fossil fuels and to move more towards renewable energies, as they would call them. And a renewable energy is defined as something that has limitless resources. And I can't remember if I said this to you guys, but I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and I came across an article. I don't have it here. I'll have to go back and look for it. Maybe I can show it to you. And maybe I shared this already. I can't remember. But the term fossil fuels is a little bit misleading, because the way that it is described in science is that fossil fuels come from fossils, okay, from dinosaurs and forests and animals and these organic materials that have decayed and have been buried over time, and they have produced all of these fossil fuels. Well, scientists have now found fossil fuels on other planets in our solar system, okay, which kind of throws a wrench in the idea of fossil fuels, because as far as we know, there's been no life on these other planets. And so how does organic matter decompose on a foreign planet that has no life and turn itself into a fossil fuel? It's quite an interesting thing. The other thing that they've discovered, by the way, is that fossil fuels are regenerating. So oil wells that supposedly have gone dry are now filling back up with oil. And so it is a legitimate mystery. We don't know. Some think it's due to tectonic plates and the shifting of rocks under the surface and freeing up other reservoirs of oil, and they're moving around. We just don't know. But the honest truth is, we don't know. Okay? And so it would be refreshing if somebody would just say that, like, hey, we don't know, and so we're building this entire ideology off of facts that aren't actually facts because we don't know. And so, I'm leading up to this article. I'm going off on a little tangent here, but the headline on this article, it comes out of the Stream, and this is what it reads. It says, "The electric vehicle bubble bursts. In fact, it explodes." Okay? And, I'm a car guy, and I've always been opposed to, from the beginning when they started putting them out, electric vehicles. I guess fundamentally they're not bad. But, but the issue, I think, with the electric vehicle market is that it was an economic idea. It was a manufacturing, thing that was created based on false ideologies. And the false statements and facts that they brought to you, the consumers, to the world, was that if you convert to electric vehicles, you will save our planet, and you will then encourage, you will decrease the production of CO2s, these dangerous CO2s that are entering into our atmosphere. But what they failed to tell people was that there's only a finite amount of lithium on our planet to make these electric batteries, and that the lithium itself is very difficult to mine and to produce. And so, it requires a lot of fossil fuels to mine the lithium and to get it out of the ground. And then it requires a lot of chemicals to turn that raw lithium into a usable source. And so it is quite involved, and it's very expensive. It's very expensive. So a lot of nation states like China and Russia and even India, the largest, most populated countries on earth, are saying, no thanks. We don't want anything to do with this idea of renewable energy. We're going to burn coal, we're going to use oil, and we're just going to produce. And that's what they're doing. In fact, China's increasing its coal-burning power plants. It's increasing its consumption of fossil fuels. And so is India, so is Russia, so are the largest, most populated nations on the earth. All the while, the Western world is moving into a territory that is very, very dangerous and concerning, because the economies of the Western world are suffering because of this ideology, and the planet is not reducing in CO2 production. That's the nature of the article. So the article makes the claim that EVs aren't the answer, electric vehicles. The technology is not up to par to gasoline engines, internal combustion engines, and then also that the sales of these vehicles is very low. And by the way, if you live in California, which we all do, our governor has passed a law that says we all have to be driving EV vehicles by 2035. And so you won't be able to buy an internal combustion engine in California after 2035. So we're about 11 years from that. It was 2030, and they freaked out and said, we can't do that, let's move it to 2035. So it's now 2035. They're going to move it again, by the way, because it's impossible. It just won't happen. But this is the foolishness of their ideas, because they're worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. The earth, Mother Earth, planet Earth, has become God, lowercase g, of these people who are making these crazy decisions. There's another side of that coin too, and I don't want to go down that rabbit trail, but there's also a lot of money behind these decisions that's lining the pocketbooks of a lot of our politicians. And so they're not making decisions for the better good of society. They're making decisions that line their own pocketbooks. So what's going to happen to the electric vehicle? Well, I don't know, but I mean, it's going to probably catch on fire and burn up, because that's what's happening to a lot of these cars too. They're overheating. They can't run in the snow. There's a mess, and they're burning up. By the way, you can't have a lithium battery on a plane, but I guess you can drive one down the freeway. So that's the absurdity of this ideology. It's just ridiculous. All right. So, anyways, enough of that. Let's move on. Okay. So this headline I thought was quite interesting. There is a very complex game of chess that's being played on the global level between the world powers. Okay. And how many of you guys heard about this terrorist attack that happened in Moscow this last week? I don't know if you guys heard about it, but there was well over 100 people that were killed. The fires that resulted from that were burning for days and days. I'm not sure if they've yet put the fires out, but anyways, there's been this attack. Well, the article here, the headline reads this. It says, the U.S. backed itself into a corner by blaming ISIS for the Moscow attack as the fires burned. And this is coming out of Russia, out of the Kremlin. And so what happened, and this is really bizarre, was this terrorist attack occurs in Moscow, and within hours, in fact, let me just read this to you, because this is what the article claims. It says that, I'll just read the first couple paragraphs. Russian Foreign Minister spokesperson Maria Zakharova on Wednesday gave an interview to Russia state-run English language media wherein she continued to advance the Kremlin's claims that the Ukrainian government or its Western partners likely had something to do with the Crocus City Hall terror attack. And she described that it was strange that a Western media narrative coalesced around ISIS being behind the attack, even as the mall and concert hall was still on fire, and emergency crews were still responding. She said the U.S. government has backed itself into a corner, given that officials made bold statements too quickly in the aftermath. The very fact that within the first 24 hours after the attack, even before the fire was put out, the Americans started screaming that it wasn't Ukraine. She says, I think is a piece of incriminating evidence in and of itself. The reason why I bring this up is because there is a war between Ukraine and Russia. Don't forget, this is raging right now. Just last week, the French government came out publicly and said, we're sending 2,000 troops into the region. And they're inviting other NATO nations to join them. And you remember our president said, we will never put troops on the ground in Ukraine. Well, we'll see. Because many countries in Europe and who are part of NATO are now mobilizing forces and moving forces into the region. They're putting troops on the ground. Now, we have a lot of military personnel in Poland, by the way, and the reason for that is what many people are saying, is that it is freeing up the Polish military. So we're there as a security force for Poland, so that the Polish military can mobilize itself and move into Ukraine. The Russians just bombed an air base in Ukraine and a train, some train tracks and a train center right outside of Poland. With what many people believe was intentional to send a message to NATO, we know how you're going to transport these people, and we're going to take them out as soon as they get here. And so that's why I said there is a chess game being played that is no joke. These are, this is World War III type of stuff that's happening right before our eyes. And by the way, we're 2 years into the war in Ukraine, and it's not de-escalating. It is escalating. This is not good news, by the way. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But, the fact that the United States and the West came out immediately and said, ISIS bombed Moscow, is quite interesting. They wanted to take away the fact that maybe it was a Ukrainian drone that was a part of it, or that Ukrainian militants had infiltrated Russia and had, instigated this terrorist attack because it was done against civilians intentionally, which is a war crime. And so it's one of the reasons why Russia is coming out and saying, wait a minute, shouldn't you investigate first and then decide who the attack was done by? And so it's quite an interesting thing that's happening. So, the terrorist attack in Ukraine, or in Russia, I'm sorry. This comes out of the stream. This is an interesting headline, and it reads this: the DCNF exclusive mandatory state training steers judges to question fitness of parents who don't affirm gender-confused kids. So let me just read this article. This is state-specific. It's about our state, California. And just so you know, it says that judges who handle child abuse and neglect cases in California are now required to take a class on LGBT issues that pushes them to consider whether parents who object to their child's preferred pronouns should retain custody of their children. The Judicial Council of California's LGBTQ plus considerations training, offered twice annually for judges working on juvenile dependency cases, instructs judges how to handle youth gender identities, advising them to be aware that LGBTQ youth may be at risk of harm at home, school, and in other settings due to biased or uninformed attitudes or conduct by peers/adults, according to a presentation from June of 2023, which was last summer, obtained by the Daily Caller News Foundation via a public records request, citing statistics on mental health problems among LGBT youth and warning judges to stay alert about physical or emotional abuse by parents. The presentation puts forward 3 hypothetical scenarios for the judges to sort through. And the article continues. So the judges are being put through classes to help inform their decisions based on parental right custody of their children who are wanting to change their genders. Because the theory that they're promoting and that they're trying to indoctrinate these judges with is that the parents are the reason why these kids are having mental health problems. So children want to kill themselves because the parent opposes their gender transition, desires. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. In fact, what we know, the facts, just from a psychological standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, is that always trauma has preceded and mental health issues has preceded the decision to change the gender. And it's usually done either in the school settings, by peers, or by social media influencers, or both. And we also know that the gender transitions of these kids further exacerbates the mental health issues. And it doesn't solve the problems at all. And so we know that kids who transition or who are transitioning, their suicidal rates are higher. And even the post-transition students or the kids who have transitioned are still at the highest levels of suicidal ideation and self-harm. And so the facts don't bear these things out. And so the indoctrination, and that's, I think, a fair word to use, of the judges is based on false premises and not reality. And so, but it doesn't take away from the fact that these are the ones who the parents will be standing before in court, and they'll be making decisions as to whether or not they're fit to continue to parent their own children. That's the reality of where we live in our state. It is quite concerning, you guys. We're living in a pagan world. Now, that's not every judge and that's not every person. And so, it's not a hopeless situation in that sense, but it is pretty dark and it is pretty dire. So, let me look at this next headline. Oh, this is interesting. This comes out of CBN, and the headline reads this: Planet Fitness, it loses $400 million after revoking the membership of a woman who was worried about a man in the locker room. So, this is awesome, by the way, all right? So this is why you can vote with your pocketbook, all right? And so when these organizations go to this crazy, extreme, then we can just say, no thanks, I don't want to do business with you anymore. And so, yes, Planet Fitness, the value of their company went down almost $500 million after they decided that they were going to allow men into the women's locker rooms. I suspect that it's going to go down even more. And so, good luck, Planet Fitness, as you go down this crazy path. Yeah, there you go, right? Yeah, just shut it down. Don't do business with them anymore. So this headline comes out of CBN also. The White House vows to bring the pride flag back to U.S. embassies. Popular conservative calls it perverse. And so, yes, the White House, the Biden administration, is determined to bring the pride flag back to the poles, the flagpoles of the embassies of America around the world. Which, by the way, if you served in the military, you swore an allegiance to the U.S., to serve and defend the Constitution, etc., and now next to our American flags will be flying the rainbow LGBTQ flag that apparently the military will be defending. Do we have a straight flag? No. Yeah, no. The answer is no. There's no straight flag. Yeah. And so, yeah, you could use it. Yeah, the American flag is the straight flag. There you go. And so, yep. But this is why we have to, as believers, get involved in our society. We can't just sit on the sidelines, you guys, and just be hopeful that things will change. We have a responsibility to get involved and to say, no, I'm not okay with that. And by the way, we're going to see this in Daniel's life today as we continue the story in Daniel 1, as Daniel says, no, not okay with that. And so I'm going to propose something different. And here's what I'm willing to do, and here's what I'm not willing to do. And I think as followers of Jesus, this is where we find ourselves. We need to get some grit and some courage so that we can come up and go against these things. So the last headline I want to read with you today is, it comes also out of CBN, and this has to do with Israel. By the way, there's still a war going on in Israel, you guys. Are you still following some of that? So Israel has moved its forces into the Rafah region, which is the southern part of the Gaza Strip. The Western world is very unhappy with Israel for going into the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And they're accusing Israel of war crimes against innocent civilians. By the way, do you remember the state senator from Pennsylvania, David Fetterman? Do you remember this guy? Or John? John, sorry, not David. John Fetterman. So John Fetterman, interestingly enough, was interviewed recently, and he was asked specifically why, as a Democrat, he's continuing to support the nation of Israel. Okay? And I thought his response was brilliant. And basically what he said, you can Google this and look it up, but he said that the reason why I'm still supporting Israel is because Israel is the nation who is asking the terrorist invaders who came and killed 1,700 plus innocent civilians, just defending and trying to live their lives peaceably, and then took a couple hundred hostages. Israel is the one saying, this can all be over if you just surrender and give us back our hostages. He said, and by the way, we need to remember this. He says, this could be over today. All they have to do is say, here's the innocent people that we captured and raped and whatever, if they're still alive. Here they are, and we give up. We won't do that anymore. We're done. And it could be over today. They refuse to do that. They are keeping the hostages, and Israel is just trying to get its people back. Listen, if Mexico came into Texas, killed 1,700 people in El Paso, captured several hundred of them, brought them back into Mexico, hid them in Mexico City, and then claimed to the world that if the U.S. came and got them, they'd be committing war crimes, what do you think the U.S. would say to the world? Go pound sand. We're getting our people back. At least the U.S. of the past would say that. I don't know what they would say today. But we would go in and we would take back our people at all cost. If you get in our way, too bad. I would suggest you get out of our way. And by the way, this is what Israel's doing. And Israel is going to great measures to try to not kill civilians. The numbers coming out of, and this is what John Fetterman said when he was interviewed, which you should read the interview. The numbers he quoted coming out of the reports from the war in Gaza and Israel is that 31,000 individuals have been killed in Gaza as Israel has gone in to try to take out Hamas and free their captives. And almost half of that, they know, are documented Hamas fighters. Now, mind you, there's over 2 million civilians living in Gaza. If Israel wanted to obliterate civilians, they would, and they can. They're going to great stakes to try to preserve civilians. And it's not easy. It's a small area, and Hamas is everywhere. In fact, the civilians, most of them are Hamas, and it's hard for them to determine between the two. And so this is the difficulty they find themselves in. So NATO and it's in the U.S. and its allies, they are passing resolutions in NATO and all these kinds of things. And so that's what this article speaks about. It says the U.S. Israeli defense chiefs meet as U.S. refusal to protect Israel from UN's rebuke reverberates. So the UN came out to rebuke Israel for what it's doing to try to free its hostages in Gaza. They rebuked them, and the U.S. refrained from commenting. And so, which basically means we kind of agree with them. Okay? And so Israel is now bringing its leaders together to try to figure out and discuss what does this mean and where do we go from here. Israel's in a real pinch, by the way, because 90% of their weapons come from us. And if the U.S. says one day, no, we're not going to give you any more, they're in a lot of trouble. They're nuclear armed, by the way. They won't say this publicly, but they will say to the world, and everybody knows, we have the ability to destroy you all, so don't push us. And so they have a last resort weapon, if you will, but obviously last resort. But the craziness of all of this is we're now living in 2024 with the possibility of Russia attacking the U.S. with nuclear weapons, China attacking Taiwan or Japan or the U.S. with nuclear weapons, North Korea testing intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear capabilities to attack the United States in the Pacific and even on our homeland. And, you know, if you grew up a generation before me, then you had these nuclear tests in school where you would climb under your desk or whatever to shield yourself from the nuclear explosion that was happening outside. But here we are again in a day where we are at risk of nuclear war at a greater, I think, chance than we've ever seen, ever. And there are red lines being drawn everywhere. There are nuclear-armed nations that are saying, this is a red line. If you cross it, we're done. We will nuke you. And we have the dumbest, that's the best word I can think of. We have the dumbest leaders who are making decisions that are putting the entire world at risk of nuclear war. It's a wild time. Now, we want to keep our eyes focused on Israel because Israel will never be destroyed. I'm just going to tell you. You know, the world is going to come against Israel, the Bible says. At some point, the U.S. is going to stop supporting Israel, and Israel will be in a dire situation. It will be hopeless. And then God will rescue them. These are prophetic events that we read in the Bible that are yet to come, and I think we're watching these things play out. Jesus said in Matthew 24 that there will be wars and rumors of wars, and that these events will be like a woman in labor experiencing birth pains. And when a woman is in labor, you can time the contractions. And as the contractions become closer and closer and closer together, you know the baby's coming really soon. And that's how Jesus described the end of the end times, the latter part of the last days. It will be like birth pains, and they'll come faster and faster and faster. There'll be diseases and pestilence, wars and rumors of wars. There'll be famines and things like that. And by the way, we don't see this in the headlines, but there are famines in the world because of the war in Russia and Ukraine. And it's happening in the third world countries. The Western world isn't experiencing that at this point, but we're just getting higher priced food. We have to pay more for our food. Well, there's other nations that aren't getting the food. And so it is happening, and it's happening in rapid succession. And by the way, the closer we get to the end, following Jesus' words, it's going to happen even more rapidly. Rapid. And so for us, he says, when you see these things happen, look up because your redemption's coming soon, right? And so I really believe that the rapture of the church is imminent. It's coming soon. And so we just need to take heart. God's in control. And let's keep our eyes on Israel because it's quite interesting what's happening over there. And there's a blessing for everyone, by the way, that blesses Israel. This is God's promise to us. That's one of the reasons why we have the Israeli flag on our stage. We believe that the Abrahamic covenant that God gave in Genesis chapter 12 is a promise to all the nations that bless Israel. And so, as foolish as it may seem to some, because the world thinks it's foolish, we're going to continue to follow God's word. Let's get into Daniel. Living out your faith, standing strong in a pagan world. What an exciting time to be alive. And for Daniel, I wonder if Daniel would say, what an exciting time to be alive. I'm a captive in Babylon. What an exciting time to be alive, And so here he is. He's been taken captive, and as you know, he's young. He's 15 approximately, and he's with some of his buddies, some other, Jewish teenagers that were taken. And he and 3 of his friends are brought into the king's palace, and they're brought into an indoctrination camp and system where they're being fed by the royal court and the king's food, and they're being taught in the schools, the highest elite schools of Babylon by the king, and they're put into a 3-year indoctrination camp where they're being given the language, the culture, the food, and they're young. These are young minds. They're impressionable. And most of the captives that are brought to Babylon, I would say the vast majority, they fall right in line after a while, and they begin to toe the line of the Babylonians, and they become Babylonians themselves. And they begin to serve the king and defend the king and will fight for the king. And so they become entirely indoctrinated, and the culture and the religion of their ancestors, of their past, of their childhood is lost and gone. It's one of the unique things about Daniel and then his 3 companions, that they don't lose that. It's quite profound that they have these convictions. You remember we looked last week at their names. We looked at how the Babylonians were one of the things that they would do is they would change their names. They would give them a new name so they could have a new identity. They could, so that the ties and the connections with their past and their culture could be removed. And and it's interesting because Daniel didn't buck that. He didn't say, I refuse to be called by a new name. He didn't argue with that. And he didn't argue with the education either, by the way, which was interesting. We don't see that he avoided going to the classes or to the school, or that he was disruptive or talked back to the teacher or refused to participate, with the educators. But the one thing that he did refuse was the food. It's quite an interesting thing. Why didn't he refuse the acquisition of the language? Why didn't he refuse the name change? Why didn't he refuse the education? Why was it that he only refused the food? And so, it begs a question, and it's an interesting thought. I was reading a commentator, and he said, the very first sin that entered the world was sin through food that was forbidden. And so here we see Daniel in Babylon refusing food that he claims is forbidden. And it was, by the way, you remember that the food that they are eating was food sacrificed to idols. It was not just a meal, but it was a religious practice. So if you eat of the food, and this is a cultural thing, by the way, if you eat of the food, you become one with the person you're eating with, okay? There was this ideology that was part of the ancient world, that sharing a meal with someone was one of the most intimate and most connecting kind of things that you could do. You would sit and share a meal with somebody. You're eating the same food I'm eating. We're becoming united together in this food. It was a social thing. It was also a religious thing. And so the food that was being served in the king's palace and the wine that was being served in the king's palace was wine and food that was offered to idols. It was tainted. It was pagan. It was anti-God. And so for Daniel, that was the line. It was like, look, I'll go to class. You could change my name, but I'm not going to become one with your God and your religion. I will not participate in the eating of this food and of this wine. Now, is there anything wrong with eating food and drinking the wine? No, the Bible doesn't say there's anything wrong with that. But what it was that these particular items were associated and affiliated with a pagan religion. And they were anti-God. And so Daniel said, no, can't participate in that. And so he proposed to the head of the eunuchs, okay, the ones that were overseeing the indoctrination of these young men. He proposed to him a compromise, all right? And God is granting Daniel tremendous wisdom, by the way. He could have gone on a starvation diet. I mean, he could have said to him, I will not eat, right? But he didn't, okay? He could have, but instead, in great wisdom, he said, look, why don't we just eat the vegetables? Because the vegetables were the one food item that was not involved in the religious practices of the Babylonians. They weren't offering zucchinis to their god, I guess. And so he was like, I'll eat the zucchini. For me, it would have to be fried. I'd be like, could you just fry the zucchini and give me some ranch dressing? I'll eat that, but I won't eat the meats and drink the wines. So he's like, we'll just eat the vegetables if that's okay with you, and then we'll evaluate it for a few days, for 10 days. If we look good, if we still look healthy to you, then could we continue that for 3 years? Okay. We're going to read this here in a second, but at the end of the 3 years, they were to be presented to the king into the service of the king. The indoctrination and training had been completed at the end of the 3 years, and now you're one of the king's wise men. You're one of his sages. You're now a member of the court. You are a servant of the king. And so Daniel proposes to the head of the eunuchs. He says, listen, I don't want to eat the meat and the wine, but we'll eat the vegetables. That's okay with us. And can you just let us try it? And if we're healthy, then maybe we can just continue that way. Now, you have to understand that Daniel's request was an affront to the king himself. Okay? Which, you're not going to eat my food. It's not good enough for you. You know what I mean? This is an affront to the king. It's an affront to the system that they'd established. It's a challenge to them, right? So this is no small thing he's asking. This isn't just like I've got a sensitivity to wine, and I'm just, I'm wondering if we could just negotiate here. I get an upset stomach. No. This was a direct affront to them. But in great wisdom, Daniel is negotiating and coming up with a compromise that might suffice both parties, okay? And so the head of the eunuchs, as it's described here in Daniel 1, agrees to a trial with Daniel. He says, okay, 10 days out of 30 years, fine. I'll give it to you. Let's just see if you're healthier than the rest of the guys. And so as we read in Daniel 1, they went on this trial period, and then at the end of that, Daniel and his 3 companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were way healthier looking. They were more spry, they were brighter, they were more energy, their complexion was great. And the head of the eunuchs was like, what in the world? You guys look fantastic. And they're like, yep. And we feel great, we're healthy. And so he agreed to let them continue that. And you got to remember, this continued now for 3 years. That's a long time. So, they were the first vegans, I guess. I mean, they were doing a vegan diet in Babylon. I mean, it's not a new thing, I guess. So for them, maybe they're the inventors of it. Maybe we should attribute that to them. Maybe we'll just call it the Daniel diet. Are you a vegan? Oh, it's just a Daniel diet. Anyway, so they're vegans, and God blesses them. There's a blessing for them, by the way, in their obedience to God. Let's read the second half of this story, all right? I want to just read this in Daniel chapter 1. Let's start in verse 8. We'll read to the end of the chapter. I'm going to go back and just pick apart a couple of things. But I want to tell you, and I want you to, as I read this, to try to determine in your mind what were the blessings or the rewards that Daniel and his companions received because of their faithfulness. So as we read this, just try to identify what you think might have been some of the blessings or the rewards that they had received from God as they continue to be faithful. By the way, sometimes we feel like being faithful to God is a drag. There's no blessing in it. And that wasn't the case for Daniel. I don't think that's the case for us either. Okay? So let's read this. I'm going to begin reading in verse 8. So in verse 8, we pick up here. And I underline this, by the way. Maybe you should underline this too. In the NIV it says, but Daniel resolved. Okay? This is a powerful statement. He didn't just think it through or just was wishy-washy in this. No, he made a resolution in his own mind as he was taken captive into Babylon. And the resolution was simply this, and it says it here, not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And so his resolution was, I am going to do everything within my power and capacity to remain faithful to my God, even in the midst of this pagan culture, pagan world. I'm a captive. I've lost all my rights, but I'm still going to remain faithful to my God. Look, many people in America today find themselves living in these very difficult situations, whether it's at work, whether it's with your family members, whether it's out in society, and you're like, I don't know what to do. Well, Daniel gives us a simple outline. It says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, which was food sacrificed to idols. And so, in great wisdom, he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. So he says to the chief, hey, listen, I can't eat this food. It's against my religion. Which, by the way, he's in the indoctrination camp, okay? And so, typically, they would just say, too bad, bro. You're eating it. Or you're dead. You have a choice. You can starve to death or you can eat it. And so, he tells him, I can't eat it. He asks for permission not to defile himself. And then the Bible says this. Look at verse 9. Now God, and you should underline that too, now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Okay. And what the official told Daniel, because he's, just thinking, he says, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? Now, by the way, you got to understand, he's not telling him no. Right away, God's already worked it out. He's spoken to this guy. He's He's like, okay, and he's moved this guy's heart in favor of Daniel and his companions, and so he doesn't come back to Daniel and say, no. He's like now negotiating. He's like, okay, look, I'm worried. Here's what the king could say. I mean, et cetera, et cetera. This is wild, by the way, because in a typical scenario, the guy would just flat say, shut up, dude. You're a slave here, man. Go and do what I said. But now he's negotiating with the slave. I'm afraid of my lord, the king, who's assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Then Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. I want to pause for a second. Daniel has proposed a test. Some people would say, well, is he testing God? And it's an interesting thing. You see, because of his faith and his conviction, he has now negotiated with the rulers that are over him, and he has put his faith to the test. You might say that it's not really faith if it's not tested. I think that's a fair statement. How could you say that Daniel had any faith if he was unwilling to put it to the test? So he proposes a test. And by the way, this isn't the first time that we see a test proposed in the book of Daniel, okay? We'll see it with his three companions later on. And so there's a pattern, I guess, that's forming as their faith is challenged, and then they put it to the test, okay? So he proposes a 10-day trial period, a test. And verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. It worked. He put it to the test. He's like, God's going to see us through this. We're going to honor him, and he's going to bless us. And sure enough, he does. And they look fantastic. And they look healthier than anybody else. And better nourished. All those things. Verse 16. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Listen, there's something very nuanced in this that I think is powerful. A year into eating vegetables, and the guy next to you's got choice wine and a beautiful prime rib. A year into it, you're going to be like, maybe I'll just take a little sip of that and take a little, maybe that cow wasn't sacrificed. I'll just try a little bite. But here's the power of what happened, right? And I think this is just a wonderful blessing from God in their lives. God removed the temptation. For 3 years, he removed the temptation for them. And so the guards never served them the food. It wasn't even presented to them. They didn't have to wrestle with the temptation of whether they would eat or drink it. The guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink, and they gave them vegetables instead. And so that God removed the temptation completely. Verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. By the way, we're going to talk about dreams and visions in the coming weeks. It's a really interesting subject. Someone said recently to me that they had a dream, and they were talking to another pastor, and the pastor said, well, I don't believe in dreams. And I thought, well, I guess you'll have to just rip that page out of the Bible. Yes, and lots of other pages. Dreams are an interesting thing, by the way, but Daniel had been given a gift from God to understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And then in verse 18, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. This is 3 years, okay? And then the king talked with them, and he found none He's like, bring them in, you guys. All right, let me see what we got. 3 years. We've been working hard. We've got these guys all trained up. They can now speak our language. Let's bring them in, all right? These are the cream of the crop. They just graduated from West Point, okay? So let's bring them in. So they bring them in, and it says in verse 19, the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. It was like an interview. He's like, let's see what the best you got. Brought him in, and he was blown away. He's like, holy cow. There's none equal to these guys. This is the most craziest thing. And so you guys are working directly with me. You got it? These are my guys now. I'm going to, the rest of you go find other things. I'm keeping these guys. Verse 20. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Daniel's faithfulness was rewarded. He did not sway from his convictions, and God blessed him. The idea in this is that if you honor God, He will bless you. The fear for us is that we will have social rejection and the things that we value will lose. And there may be some truth in that. Maybe the things that you value, you might lose. But if you honor God, He will bless you. And it might be true that some of the things you value, maybe are some things that you really shouldn't value. And He's going to restructure your value system. It's interesting when Daniel sort of resolved himself to do this. He didn't make any excuses about why he had found himself in this difficult situation. We don't read in Daniel chapter 1 that he came to God and said, "Why, God, am I in Babylon? Don't you love me? How could I end up in this terrible situation? I find myself far from home. I have no friends, no family. They may even be dead. And here I am in a foreign land, in a pagan nation, being served or offered pagan food. And why? Why, God? Why?" We don't see that. Somehow, Daniel was able to get over this, I'm going to blame God for my current difficult situation, and I'm going to just trust Him. And I'm going to honor Him. And I'm going to be true to Him and be faithful in the best ways that I can. And so, he didn't make excuses. He just resolved not to defile himself. I will remain true and faithful to my God, even in the midst of this difficult situation. And so, what are the ways that God blessed him? How was his faithfulness rewarded? There's 3 ways, and I'm just going to mention these real quick because we're running out of time. In verse 9, we see the first blessing, and I'll say it this way, that God blessed Daniel with influence. The ability to influence even the highest people in the kingdom. John Maxwell, I love his definition of leadership because he says leadership is influence. Nothing more, nothing less, just influence. And God gave this 15-year-old boy tremendous leadership skills. He was able to influence everybody around him. That was a blessing from God. We see in verse 20 that he was given insight. God was giving him sort of the ability to see beyond the natural and to see things that others couldn't see. Tremendous insight. He and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were able to have wisdom 10 times greater than all the rest of those in the kingdom. He was given this great wisdom, this great insight. They were enlightened by God, if you will. They had refused to participate in the religious practices of the Babylonians. They remained true to their God, and he blessed them with influence over the king himself and his court, and tremendous wisdom and insight. And then next week when we get into this, into chapter 2, we're going to see that they were given the blessing of, particularly Daniel, of interpretation. We're going to see a dream that's presented to Daniel here, and he's given the ability to interpret this dream. God rewarded him with influence, with insight, with these interpretation skills, and it just further enhanced his position and his value in the kingdom of Babylon. It's a tremendous thing. He remained a slave, if you will, a captive. But we'll see as Daniel's story progresses that he rises to the highest level of government within the Babylonian kingdom. If he had drinking the choice wine and eaten those prime ribs, he would not have received any of these blessings. And so the simple truth is that if you honor God, he will bless you. And he was blessed because of his faithfulness. You know, when you find yourself living as a foreigner, if you will, in a pagan world, I think there are some really cool lessons we can learn from Daniel. And by the way, I think Daniel also teaches us this one valuable lesson. Don't fear the consequences. Because I think that's one of the great challenges that we have, is that we fear the consequences. And Daniel said, no, doesn't matter. When he came to them and said, I'm asking you, to not eat this. They could have said, well, you don't have a choice, you're going to eat it. And he says, well, then he'd have to come back and say, well, I'm not going to eat it. And then they would say, then you're dead. But it didn't matter for him. He wasn't afraid of the consequences. And really it's a testimony to his value system. You see, Jesus told us that we should not value our lives above, righteousness and truth, and that our lives should be second to those things. And so when a person puts their life, their position, their title, their money above righteousness and truth, then you'll see them compromising all the time. And so it really is a testimony to his value system. What is it that you value most? You'll be tested at times in life to show what it is that you value the most. And Daniel was here. And what he valued the most was his relationship with God. And he didn't want to defile that or compromise it in any way. And so he said, no, my relationship with God is of the utmost importance to me. Nothing else matters. And God blessed him. And he prospered him in the midst of this pagan world. And we're going to see that he runs into a lot of challenges, by the way. This isn't the first. And yet God continues to bless him. And so, yes, we have some lessons to learn. Standing strong in a pagan world. What do you value most? And stick to that. And I hope for you it's your relationship with God and your faithfulness to him. Let me pray for us. Lord, I want to thank you for the story of Daniel's life. And Lord, I just ask that you would help us to stand strong in our world today. We do love you, God, and we want to honor you and please you with the way that we live our lives. And so would you fill us up with your Holy Spirit? And would you empower us, increasing our faith and our ability to stand courageous and to make the decisions to not compromise in the face of great challenges and adversity. And thank you that in Daniel's life we see that as he did these things, that you blessed him. You didn't abandon him, but you blessed him. And so, Lord, our lives are in your hands, and we trust you. Thank you, God, for being trustworthy and for loving us. And so would you go before us tonight as we do our very best to be salt and light in this dark world. I just pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, God bless you guys.